Hi everyone. Today we're going to cover some of those odds and ends of the nervous system that don't really kind of justify a whole video all by themselves. So we've talked about the brain and the different structures within the brain and their specific functions. So let's make sure that we covered a couple of things that aren't necessarily on your anatomy list. So you don't need to be able to identify them, but you do need to understand what those structures do. We talked about the limbic system. That is your emotional brain. As part of the limbic system, you have the amygdala, which I mentioned before, which is sort of your fear center or anger center. The limbic system oftentimes will match odors to emotions. If you've ever noticed that sometimes when you smell something, it makes you feel a certain way. And it also includes the hippocampus, which is important for converting new information into long-term memory, which is what we're hoping to do this semester. Now, I mentioned that before that we weren't going to spend much time on memory, so we're just going to hit some highlights here. Your working memory or short-term memory lasts seconds to maybe hours. It's very limited in its capacity, so it can only hold a very small amount of new information. Whereas your long-term memory is essentially limitless. You can put as much information as you possibly can in there. And what our goal is over the course of the semester is to take some short-term working memory of new A&P information and make sure that we have it there so that you can use it later. Some tips for converting short-term to long-term. Being alert and motivated is a big part of it. Many of you have probably seen my postings where I say repetition, repetition, repetition. It helps if you can associate new information with old information. So using analogies to relate something new to something you're already familiar with. That's one of the reasons why I often recommend starting with sometimes a very simple video or a very simple concept and then scaffolding more layers of information on top of that makes it easier to remember. There's nothing wrong with starting with a video that was designed to teach something about the body to middle school level students and then adding more information to it to get to where you need to be. So you ultimately want to get to automatic memory. Now, if we do a really quick recap here of your major structures, you've got the corpus callosum. This whole area in here is the thalamus. The thalamus is composed of two parts that actually connect in the middle at that dot. So they kind of look like an open clamshell that's held together at a hinge. And that dot right there is the hinge. Remember, the corpus callosum connects the hemispheres of this cerebrum up here. And the thalamus is your operator relaying information to where it needs to go. You've got the little pineal gland back here that releases melatonin to make you sleepy. You've got the hypothalamus that makes a couple of hormones. We're missing something here. There should be a little stalk sticking off called the infundibulum attached to the large pituitary gland, which is your master gland. You've got your cerebellum, which helps you with fine motor skills. The white matter of the cerebellum is the arbor vitae. You've got the midbrain, which helps you with consciousness, eye and ear reflexes, and helps this guy make your motor skills very smooth. The pons, which relays to the cerebellum, and the medulla oblongata that keeps you alive. Now, within the brain, we have areas of gray matter and white matter, and we've talked about what is contained within gray matter and white matter before. If I cut into the brain, you'll notice you can see this darker outer layer here of the cerebrum. That is called the cerebral cortex. And that is the gray matter of the cerebrum. And then you can see inside the white matter here, which is just those myelinated axons going throughout the brain. Where those two hemispheres connect right there is that corpus callosum. Here you can see the lateral ventricles that we talked about before. When we look at the spinal cord, we actually have 31 segments. Each one of these segments has its own pair of spinal nerves that's branching off of that spinal cord. The spinal nerves are generally grouped by what level of the vertebrae they're associated with. And as you go down the spinal cord, you'll notice some enlargements. There's a cervical enlargement where it gets wider up here, and a lumbar enlargement down here. Those enlargements are where we have a lot of nerves branching off to your arm and your leg. And then at the very end, there's kind of this stringy structure. That's the cauda equina, which means horse's tail. And that's where you have all the nerves kind of separate from each other. And if I needed to go in and get a sample of fluid or put an injection, I could go into that cauda equina, and I'm less likely to hit a nerve, because if you have a bunch of spaghetti hanging down and I use a nerve to poke into it, they're just going to move aside if I go slowly. Whereas if I have my whole spinal cord and I poke in too far, I'm going to jab the spinal cord, which is going to make your patient very unhappy. When we look at the spinal cord, we see a few things here. All right, we see that the gray matter and white matter are reversed. So in the spinal cord, my gray matter is on the inside, shaped kind of like a butterfly, and my white matter is out here around it. In the very center is a hole that cerebral spinal fluid flows through, and that's called the central canal. So let's take a little bit more detailed look at the spinal cord. So we have our gray matter here, the little butterfly, and our white matter and our central canal. And you'll notice that on one side here we have a root, a nerve root coming off. This is called the posterior or dorsal root. And we have one coming off the other side, which is the anterior or ventral. Sorry, my pen's being a little weird. Or ventral root is coming off down here. Now, I can tell when I'm looking at a picture or a model that this is the posterior or dorsal root, because we notice it comes to an enlargement here called the dorsal root or posterior root ganglion. And if you remember, a ganglion is where you have a cluster of cell bodies. So I have a cluster of cell bodies out in my peripheral nervous system here in a ganglion. Now, where these roots join together here, then, is my spinal nerve. So I've kind of circled or labeled the key structures that you need to know here. Now the horns are just the different projections of the gray matter that stick up, and they can be mapped to different functional regions. Now, if I look at my spinal nerve, it's like a two-way highway. But when I look at my nerve roots, those are one-way directions. So if I've got my dorsal root here, I have incoming information that comes in through that dorsal root. So that's motor. or sorry, sensory, that's sensory. And then as I'm going out through my ventral or anterior root, so that's motor. So in my spinal nerve, it's going both directions, but in my roots, it's incoming on the posterior or dorsal side, outgoing or motor on the ventral or anterior side. So let's take a look at a spinal cord model and see if we can relate that. So there's like a little hole in the center, so that's my central canal. I have my gray matter here. I have my white matter around it. I have an enlargement here, dorsal or posterior root ganglion, which means that this is my dorsal or posterior root, which means that this is my anterior or ventral root, and where they join together over here is a spinal nerve. Remember that my dorsal side is incoming, so I have incoming information here, so this is sensory. And then I have outgoing information here, so that is motor. So as we mentioned, our spinal nerve splits into dorsal and ventral roots. That dorsal root we said is sensory. The dorsal root or posterior root ganglion has the cell bodies of those sensory neurons. My ventral root is the motor root, and then the spinal nerve is where those two roots come together. Let's talk for a minute about reflexes. So reflexes are predictable, automatic, or involuntary responses to a stimulus. Now notice I said it's involuntary, so you do not consciously control reflexes. And I also mentioned that it's predictable. So if the doctor hits kind of like right below the knee with a hammer, your leg is going to kick. If he hits with that little rubber hammer a second time, you're not going to punch him in the face. Your leg is going to kick again. So it's always going to be the same response. Reflexes can be intrinsic, or we sometimes call that innate, which means born with it. Or it can be acquired, which means it's learned. So if you think about intrinsic reflexes, those would be things that even a baby can do. So they can blink, cough, vomit, grasp, right? There are certain reflexes they automatically can do. But there are a lot of reflexes that we acquire over time. Walking is a good example. Catching a ball. Drooling when you smell certain foods. And there are lots of reflexes that we acquire. Driving a car, for example, is something that we acquire and we don't really have to think as much about on a regular basis when we're doing it. Have you ever gotten home from work and you think about it for a minute and you're like, I think I went through those lights and stopped if they were red, but I don't even remember crossing those roads. So it does become sort of automatic. Now, sometimes reflexes involve higher brain centers, but often only involve those peripheral nerves in the spinal cord. So it never goes to your brain for processing. When you look at a reflex, there are 5 main parts. You first have to have a receptor. So your receptor has to receive the signal, responds to some kind of stimulus. It's going to generate an action potential in a sensory neuron. That is going to carry information to my integrating center, which is going to be, or think of it as a control center. So that's your brain or spinal cord. Then we're going to leave through a motor neuron. And finally, we're going to end up at an effector. An effector is something that carries out a command. So these are going to be smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. So again, we start with the receptor. Oftentimes these are proteins. They're going to generate an action potential in a sensory neuron that's going to carry the signal to my control center, which is my brain or spinal cord. I'm going to go out through that motor neuron, and I'm going to tell an effector what to do. Something you can try at home if you want is try to see if you can develop a new reflex. So have a couple people get together in your house if you can, and try something where you have to complete a new task within a very specific amount of time. So you're trying to do something as quickly as possible. So if you have more than one person, you can have them line up. You can tap somebody on the shoulder and they have to go down the row tapping each other's shoulders, and then have the last person in the line say stop. Time that and then repeat it, and you'll notice that your time should drop. You should be able to get faster and faster. But then when you complicate things like alternating your arms, then all of a sudden it's not a reflex anymore. You have to kind of relearn that. So that's why when you think about certain jobs like pilots or surgeons or EMTs or anything like that, you have to clock hours and hours and hours of practice time so that these things become very reflexive. When you look at one of these nerves, we know that a nerve is actually a bundle of axons from the neurons. So we want to keep these things very organized. Otherwise, we'd have a big tangled mess of spaghetti in the body and we'd be damaging nerves like crazy. So we have 3 connective tissue coverings that are going to cover that nerve and organize it. And the first one is going to be the endoneurium. Endo is inside or within. So this is going to cover an axon of a specific neuron. So it's going to cover a single axon. We're going to take several of those axons and we're going to bundle them together. So imagine that I have a piece of paper and I have a pen. I'm going to take this axon and I'm going to wrap it up in endoneurium. Now I'm going to take several axons and I'm going to put them together and I'm going to wrap them in another layer of connective tissue to keep them organized. That bundle of axons that I just created, I'm going to call a fascicle. So a fascicle just means a bundle. fact, you have fascicles of muscle fibers in your muscles. And we're going to wrap those fascicles in connective tissue called perineurium. So this is going to cover a fascicle, which in this case is a bundle of axons. And then we're going to take several bundles and we're going to put them together. So here's a fascicle, there's a fascicle, and another one. And we're going to bundle all of those together in this outer connective tissue covering called the epineurium. So epi is above or on the outside. So this is going to cover an entire nerve. Now the nice thing is, once you know these terms, they're going to be very similar when we're learning the different connective tissue layers that are going to organize muscles, because we're going to use endomysium, paramysium, epimysium, and we're going to wrap those muscles up. And then those connective tissue layers are going to come out the end of the muscle and form the tendon. So we'll be talking about that in a week or so. I think we'll stop there and we'll come back and wrap up our terminology in the next video.